All right, well, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Jeff Hunt. I'm with the National Academy of Sciences. But for today, I'm just your moderator here for this first ever virtual group meeting on public engagement with science. Our hope is that this becomes a sort of regular thing, and I've been working with the folks at AAAS, in particular Emily Cloyd and Alana Kimbrell, to set this up because it overlaps a lot with what they're doing on the Trellis platform. The idea here is to have sort of a regular discussion about all things dealing with public engagement, a little more interactive, face-to-face, you might say, than sort of a Twitter chat or something that can happen in a blog post or discussion forum. So this is an experiment and should be treated as such. So we're trying this out in terms of formats, in terms of structure, in terms of content. So any feedback is welcome. Anything's open to change. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and definitely all of our panelists and our moderator for going with this first topic. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to the people who are going to give the crux of the presentation, and then at the end I'll come back and follow up items. But the structure, and Erin, Heath will lay this out a little bit, will be very sort of informal. We'll hear some comments from our panelists, but we want this to be sort of a back and forth more than them sitting there talking about stuff. We want to hear questions. Everybody, just from a logistical standpoint, is on mute. Yes, it is being recorded. If you have a question, please use the chat box, which if you can hover over your window, it's down there at the bottom. It says chat, and you can type a message to everyone. Emily's sitting there ready to pounce on your questions, to pass them to Erin. So that will be the preferred method of communication. You could also post on the Trellis page or on Twitter. Just make sure to tag somebody who's been in one of those tweets, and we will make sure to get your questions answered as well as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
All right, thanks so much, Jeff. I'm very excited to be here with all of you. My name is Erin Heath. I'm Associate Director of Government Relations here at AAAS, and behind me, as mentioned, is my colleague Emily Cloyd, who will switch places with me later on in the discussion. So I'm going to ask the same question to our three panelists to start. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and talk about their work, that is, what you're working on with respect to facilitating scientist engagement of policymakers. I'm going to start with you, Karen. Can you tell us more about who you are and what you're working on?
Yeah, thanks so much, Erin, and thanks so much, everybody. It's really an honor to join all of you today. So I'm a visiting scholar this year at AAAS, which has been a lot of fun. And let me just tell you quickly something about myself, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that I'm doing actually with Erin and Emily, as well as a researcher from the University of Michigan. So I'm a science communication researcher, and I've helped teach researchers how to better communicate their science, including especially with policymakers. And I had an opportunity last year actually to serve as a congressional fellow for a year through the American Geophysical Union and also AAAS. And in doing that, I quickly realized that my ideas of how science were communicated and used for policy didn't align with reality quite the way that I thought, which led to this year-long project that I'm currently conducting with University of Michigan's Maria Carmen Lemos, as well as Erin and Emily, who you see right now. And when I tell people that I am studying communication use of science in Congress, typically the response I get is, well, that should be a short project. So I was that both Maria Carmen Lemos and also the folks at AAAS thought otherwise and were willing to take this dive with me. So let me tell you a little bit about the project. It started from a conceptual model that Maria Carmen Lemos and her colleagues developed that attempts to describe what is known about the conditions under which useful research produced by scientists becomes usable in the eyes of policymakers. And so they did a wide literature review, and they identified sort of three categories that they thought were really important. So one was information content, one was policymaker context, and the third was the relationship that develops between the scientist and the policymaker. And Lemos uses the terms to describe these as fit, interaction, and interplay. But interesting, a lot of the literature that went into that review and served as the basis of the model really analyzed the use of science by natural resource managers. And so if you think about Congress, it's a tad of a different place, right? So our question was, how well does this conceptual model align with the usability factors that they've identified across these three categories? And then the question is, who is the policymaker, right? So again, they can be a natural resource manager, right? They can be, a policymaker can be a wide range of decision makers. So in our case, we know, and probably a lot of you who work with the Hill know that staffers take a wide role in meeting with constituents and stakeholders who may bring them scientific information. And they also are vetting lots of types of scientific information for use in communication by the office or decision-making by the office. So in this case, our policymakers are staffers. And I must admit, I was a tad biased having worked staffers for that audience as well. So the project itself started with a workshop. And actually, one of the questions we were posing is, I think, one that's interest today, which is, what do both practitioners know? Because a lot of you, I presume, work, like as does Erin, and Emily has as well, work closely with policymakers on the Hill. And so you know a lot already about what you think works and doesn't work. And then researchers, academic researchers, have slightly different perspective and think they may know a slightly different set of information. So we started with workshop, and there's actually a workshop report on the public engagement site that we produced as well. And then we did a series of, we did interviews with 16 staffers. We also did a survey with congressional fellows to see if scientists use science differently or the same as staffers on the Hill who may not have the same scientific background. And lastly, we're currently in the stage of surveying staffers themselves. So because the project is not completely complete, I can't give you the final results, but I am going to tell you just really briefly before I pass this back to Erin, we've been looking at two areas especially. One is barriers to use of science, a lot of which are essentially communication barriers, and then also bias, which I may touch on later, hopefully in our conversation. So just to quickly get you a sense of some things that we're finding that I think may be interesting or useful to you. So we asked staffers in our interviews, I'll literally tell you the question, what if anything makes it difficult for you to use scientific information? In those cases where the office already has a position on an issue, because you can imagine lots of offices, they know pretty well where they stand on a wide array of issues that often come through the doors. And then also on an issue in which they may not have a position. And so the things that we found just overall across both two that we heard most frequently is that informational complexity, big surprise. Science is complex, right? That is difficult for people to process and process it rapidly. Also, it's not always conclusive, right? Evidence doesn't always say something that speaks especially to that particular policy issue. And then availability and accessibility, right? A lot of this information is behind paywalls, right, in libraries. And so staffers may not be able to easily access it. And then finally, they're under really tight time constrictions, right? So lack of time and or resources to access it. We're three big areas. And then the last thing I want to point out is that what we're looking for is, are there differences in the context? So in a case where an office already has a position, which we would term sort of strategic use of science, are they using that differently, science in a just different way, or are there different barriers to using it than when they're using it when this is a completely new issue, right? So think of self-driving cars. That's a relatively new issue for a lot of people on the Hill. So they may not have a position on that yet. And so what we did see is there are three areas, and to be honest, for a lot of people who work with the Hill, these are it's a little bit of a no duh. But time and resources. So when staffers are working on an issue in which the office already has a position, and that's probably an issue that maybe things are happening. If they're saying they're working on it because they're hearing something's going on, they really don't have a lot of time and resources to put to it. And so things we heard, things like just reading the academic literature is too time consuming. There's a ton of information. They don't have the time to figure out what's the right information and what are some of the factors what are some of the angles that are being pushed from certain sources and make them more leery. The other thing is that obviously if you have a policy position, that policy position may not jive completely with maybe what potential consequences are of that scientific information. And also there may be a lot of other decision factors, right, that are bigger issues than the science. So things that we were hearing from scientists included substantive use of science to make a decision in this case, is prohibitive at a certain stage. Like the office has made a decision, they're a certain way along in terms of legislation maybe, and after a certain point, it's very difficult to include new information that may be contradictory. Also, clearly, science isn't the only factor in condition decisions. And also, when there are sort of a whole, a range or buffet of facts, that to some extent you have to essentially cherry pick the ones that seem to fit the types of arguments that maybe your office has been making for a long time. And lastly, I think this is also, again, probably will resonate with a lot of people, is that where we saw that lack of contacts and lack of ability to get scientific information particularly seemed to come up in those cases where offices didn't already have a position on that issue. And because they don't know people in that area, right? And so in that area, finding new contacts who actually know something about that topic is a lot more difficult. And so finally, just to wrap up and toss this back to you, Erin. So I think one of the things that in 1985, David Whiteman, who's a political scientist, had looked at how congressional committees were using information, scientific information coming out of the Office of Technology Assessment, the now extinct Office of Technology Assessment. And at that time, he found out that there was a ratio of almost 3 to 1 of strategic use of science to substantive use of science, i.e. you're supporting your policy position by cherry picking versus, this is a little bit of rough, versus using it to make a decision on an area you haven't. And we're actually finding similarly high ratios of strategic to substantive use of science. So I think it's also indicative that this is also something that's not new, that's actually been around for quite a long time on the Hill. And with that, I'll pass it back. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Karen. Liz, I'm going to turn to you next, and I'm going to ask you the same question. Tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, who you are, and secondly, what you're working on. Oh, you got to unmute.
All right, here we go. So my name is Liz Suhay, and I'm at the Department of Government in the School of Public Affairs at American University, and I'm a political scientist. What I'm doing specifically on this topic is I'm engaged in a research project called Evidence-Based Science Communication with Policymakers. And this is something that is very much a collaboration with two of our hosts, Emily Cloyd and Erin Heath of AAAS, as well as Erin Nash, who actually just took a new job in Sydney, Australia. And this is an outgrowth. So first of all, I should mention that it's funded by NAS as well as the Rita Allen Foundation. And it's really a response to the National Academy's report, Communicating Science Effectively. So that report really matched my perspective that the field of science communication has grown rapidly, and there's a lot of great research out there, basically giving people guidance as to how to communicate science. Most of it, though, focuses on communicating science with the public generally. And the scholarly research hasn't grown in the same way with respect to communicating science to policymakers specifically. So this is what we wanted to tackle with this project. And I will say that my research is even at an earlier stage than Karen's, so I am not going to be able to probably share even as much as she did, but there certainly are some things that I'll be able to share. And we'll do so throughout this webinar. So let me just give you the general layout of our project. So there are 4 components. So we're starting with a literature review. And that literature review, that sounds really boring, but this literature review is multidisciplinary, and it's spanning across a dozen fields to basically pick up just about every piece of scholarly research that's been done out there on communicating science with policymakers specifically, and that's going to include broad theoretical works as well as very applied research, you know, in individual science disciplines. So we are about done with that literature review. We also just finished a survey of scientists. So this is actually a survey of a selection of AAAS members. And we're gauging their communication with policymaker practices and experiences. We have the data. We haven't analyzed them yet. So that is coming up. Something we're deeper into is I have been interviewing members of Congress as well as their personal and committee staff. So there's a parallel there with what Karen has been up to. And the fourth component is a deep dive into committee hearings on climate change, as well as one or two other science issues to understand the intersection of political polarization and the informational quality of hearings on the Hill. So that's a lot. So what we are planning to do with this research, independently, these pieces are, I think, interesting and will be contributions to the scholarly literature, but we also have this important applied component that I hope will be of interest to you all, which is at the end of this, what we're going to do is we are going to put together a report to the National Academies. And that report, in addition to summarizing these individual components, it's actually going to include a set of recommended practices for communicating with US policymakers specifically, so elected officials on the Hill as well as their staff. So that report is going to be coming out in January of 2019. I have already given one kind of preliminary presentation, so we have some ideas as to what we ultimately will be recommending, but we're going to have to wait for that final report for our official recommendations.
Thanks so much, Liz. Ben, you are up. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on. You are a practitioner on the panel.
Sure. So thank you. I am Ben Corb. I'm the Public Affairs Director for the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. At times, I'm a lobbyist. At times, I'm an advocate to agencies. And at times, I'm pulling my hair out trying to figure out why scientists aren't engaging in the process as much as we'd like. Some of the, I think, the interesting change in perspective from what I'm working on and what we're working on at ASBMB versus what some of the previous speakers were talking about was I'm focused on the scientist and getting the scientist more educated and more involved in the political process. So I think, and I'm certainly not the only one, there are plenty of other scientific societies that are doing comparative and comparable work. But what we would like to do is help to kind of break down the walls that scientists feel stop them from engaging in the political process, be that not understanding the process, being intimidated by the process, having some misunderstandings about how policy works, or bringing personal bias to kind of getting involved in policy. So from our perspective, our advocacy work succeeds only as well as the scientists, only as well as we have engaged, informed, comfortable scientists in the process. And so ASBMB is doing a couple of programs that I just wanted to talk about. One of them is not specifically and solely focused on science policy, but on the art of science communication. And Jeff knows a lot about this because he really helped to start this program at ASBMB. But we offer an online training course for scientists to engage with experts in communication and learn how to talk to a non-scientific audience about science, about their research, and about their science. Because one thing that we would really like to do is bridge the gap between scientists and non-scientists and try to eliminate that perspective that each side of that gap has, which is viewing the alternative side as an other. Right? I think too often scientists view non-scientists as an other group of people with other perspectives. And the lay public views scientists as these other unapproachable kind of people that I can't connect with. So we want to help to bridge those gaps. And so step one is to help scientists be more comfortable in their skin and communicating what they do and how they do it to the lay public. And so it's a really intensive course. It's a very low cost course. And we've been running it for several years now. There are more than 100, I believe this is true, there are more than 100 alumni of the course that have gone through the process. I think now we're even at a point where some of the teachers of the course are people who were earlier involved in the course in its early stages and kind of went through the process. So scientists helping scientists learn how to communicate is really important. From a policy standpoint, kind of a next phase that we're working on at ASBMB is we have what's called the Advocacy Training Program, the ATP. And what we're doing is trying to take a core cohort of scientists who would like to do more than just the send a letter to their member of Congress thing. more than the click an email 6 times and generate your letter to your member of Congress, but really engage at a deeper level. And what we would like to do is kind of form this special forces version of our advocacy effort across the country with scientists who are interested in engaging and have gone and learned more about the process. And so what we've been doing is we have a bi-weekly teleconference with experts in the field where we've talked about things from just the process, understanding how a bill becomes a law, what committees are, how members of Congress get elected and how they operate and how their staffs function, to also talking about how policies are formed. How does someone like me or you, Erin, or others in the field, how do we engage with legislators and see an idea, a good idea turn into a piece of legislation that turns into a law and a policy that's enacted by the federal government. We've also talked about how to engage with the scientific agencies. So advocacy to us is more than just going to Capitol Hill and asking for policies that are helpful or asking for increases in funding and more federal support, but it's also going to the federal agencies that are funding our science and helping them to understand the problems and the barriers to success that scientists are feeling in their laboratories, and helping them to engage, in formulation of policies that'll help to encourage growth within the scientific field. So that is something we've just started, and the idea that we would like to do is we'd like to have at a base 1 or 2 of our members in all 50 states engaged in this process, so that one, we know that we have people that we can reach out to. So when we know that there is a policymaker in Maine, I have a couple of people in Maine that I can reach out to that can begin a conversation at a local level and really discuss it in a local way. But also, it creates a feedback loop where we can hear from the field about policy issues, maybe state policy issues that we're not able to track as well, or things that people are hearing. And let's say I'm in Denver right now, so maybe there's some Colorado issues that are happening, but we can have it can be a reciprocal conversation. So it's not just ASBMB's policy office delineating outward to scientists across the country what to do, but we're collecting information and hearing from people across the country and helping that to shape and direct the way that we go. And so those are 2 of the exciting programs that we're working on, and again, focused on engaging and educating the scientists. And I really look forward to the results, for instance, of Elizabeth's work, so that we can know what we've been doing that works or how we can be doing it better, and refocus it and retarget it going forward. But it's all part of, I think, a really important part of a chain that we need to understand on all sides.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. I'd like to turn it back to Karen and Liz, and I wanted to ask you if there are any observations you'd like to add about what the research tells us about what actually works in engaging policymakers. Let's go to Liz first this time.
You have to unmute yourself first.
Oh, you're still on mute, Liz. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry, I have a mute button here, but apparently there's a delay. So note to self. Okay. So a clarification, Erin. So would you like me to talk some about the literature that we've been reviewing, or would you like me to talk about our interviews, or some combination?
I'm going to leave that to your discretion.
Okay, how about if I do a little bit of both? But I'll try to be succinct. So the literature out there on communicating with policymakers, and I have to credit this to Erin Nash, who's been doing a lot of this reviewing, there appear to be 2 major models as to how to communicate well with policymakers. So one is called the Creel model. I don't know if folks out there are familiar with this. So the Creel model says that communication should be credible, meaning it meets scientific standards, should be relevant, meaning it is seen as significant and usable by policymakers, and the communication should be seen as legitimate, meaning it comes from an unbiased and a fair process. So there's a big model out there. A lot of folks have built on it and referenced it. There's more recently been a different model that's been proposed called the ACTA model. And the ACTA model really digs into this idea of how important it is that science being communicated to policymakers be relevant? And so they really dig into that category and add a little bit elsewhere. So the ACTA model says that the communication should be accessible, meaning easily understood. It should be comprehensive, meaning it should be broad. That there should be attention paid to timing, which a lot of scientists are not aware of. There are certain windows of opportunity. And finally, this model says that your communication should be applicable to the particular context. So, for example, you'll be changing what you're presenting based on a particular policy problem that you're discussing. So we have these two models out there. Personally, from what I've seen, I think these models are both great. We have the Creel model, which is a little bit higher level, and the ACTA model, which is, I think, a bit more applied. What's different, I think, about what we're doing is that a lot of the research that's taken place has not necessarily focused on elected officials. It's focused on people who are working in agencies and staff. And I will also say that much of this research has been carried out outside of the United States. So in the US context, we're looking at elected officials, and as you all know, this is a pretty polarized context. So I think those two things are going to lead to us coming to some different conclusions. So we'll build on these prior models, and then we'll have some new things to offer. I will also add that I think something that is different about our research is that we are very much in tune with the advances that have been made in science communication to the public, and we'll be thinking about how some of those strategies also can be useful, for example, on the Hill. So let me just tell you a few things that have come out of our current research that is a little bit different from what the prior models have recommended. So first of all, on Capitol Hill, the thing I hear over and over again is an emphasis on personal relationships. So personal relationships are useful because people are so busy. It's wonderful to have somebody who's a resource, who's an established resource that they can go to, that they can have on speed dial, that they can reach out to quickly. Personal relationships are also important in the current environment because of, because things are so polarized, that having somebody you can trust is really critical. So the second thing that we're hearing in our research is how important it is when you're speaking with policymakers who are elected officials specifically, to think about what is in it for their district. If they're a senator, that would be their state. We can debate about whether, that's normatively the correct way for us to be thinking about things, but at the end of the day, they are representing those individuals and are, of course, worried about re-election. I can expand on that if folks are interested. And the last thing I would say is that, interestingly, we hear often folks on the Hill saying they do appreciate good narratives. And I find that interesting because it is so much something that's been emphasized in the existing research on science communication with the public. So people really appreciate a good story, but that said, they very much want those stories to be paired with quality research. They want to know that there's quality data behind that story. So that's what I have.
Thanks so much, Liz. Karen, anything you'd like to add to that?
So maybe just to set up the context a little bit. So both of us are taking a sort of the similar problem from slightly different literatures. So Liz, as you heard, is a political scientist, and she's working with a philosopher, if I'm correct. And I'm taking sort of a communication approach, which actually comes a lot out of psychology, and then also sort of more about public policy / political science approach. So, and one of the things that came out of our workshop, talking to people from practice and also in the academic end, is that it's just really hard to quantify the impacts of communicating science with policymakers. And so what we've tended to see in the literature especially sort of, again, sort of the political science and public policy literature, is that there has been a lot of qualitative work, decades and decades of qualitative work of case studies, especially within, I think, as Liz was pointing out, within the executive. And so, for example, like Sheila Jasanoff has just done some amazing stuff in looking at how science is being used in places like the EPA. And so to some extent, actually, when we started having conversations this fall, people were actually just telling me that this area is pretty much dead. It's not really that of interest to political science anymore, because people felt like they have gotten as much as they can get, because policymakers are unlikely to tell you really what was the reason they made a certain decision. And so it's just really hard to quantify. And if you have tons and tons of case studies, to what extent are any of those generalizable? So what I think is really interesting that we're seeing, though, is that we're seeing sort of this rise of interest in this area, and from a multidisciplinary approach. And so actually, especially Paul Kearney's work at the University of Stirling in the UK, I think is actually so a great case where you see, so he's a political science public policy person, but he's also calling upon literature and communication and psychology to get essentially at multi-level analyses. So thinking about not only in the political science and public policy world about what are coalitions doing, what is the role of coalitions in terms of how issues evolve, how are the sort of broader societal events, things like media and stochastic events, affect how you may see policy change, but also specifically thinking about like how does persuasion work on a communication on an individual level, and things like how does the psychology of decision-making, how does that affect policymakers? And so I think we're really beginning to see this interesting collision of sort of multi-level analysis with different types of methodologies and different types of theories, which is really fascinating. And so precisely sort of getting back to the point that I think we actually really don't know a lot out there about this very question. One of the things that we're hoping to do is actually start asking people, specifically in terms of the context of legislative science advice, we're going to start a project looking at sort of what are the research questions that people have, both practitioners and also from academics. And so I'm very happy if you, I'll put my email up there. If you guys have research questions on this topic, we'd be thrilled to get them from you.
Great, thanks so much. Ben, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you, what's some of the observations about what works resonate with you as a practitioner?
Sure. I think one thing, and I'm curious how the research that's being done is going to address this. There are 535 policymakers in Capitol Hill, and each one of them does it in a different way, right? And so I think the challenge for us in engaging with a policymaker is knowing ahead of time, am I engaging with someone who's going to want to hear data and want to see the numbers and want me to bring in the number of, NIH grants that are funded in your district or the number of patents that have been awarded in your district in the past year? Are you going to be driven by that? Or are you the member that wants to hear about the stories? The instances of cancer in your district, whether there's a cancer cluster there, the research that's happening there, the impact that global warming is happening on your coastline. Understanding how to navigate through that from an office by office basis, right? So, it might be a meeting at 10:30 to talk to one person that's completely data driven, and then the next meeting at 11 is going to be entirely story driven. So how do we juggle that and engage there? I think that's a really important question. I think for practitioners, we've been doing kind of a throwing spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks sort of approach. One White House staffer that I work with frequently, often said that stories make you memorable and data makes you credible. And so, that's a message we try to instill in our scientists, which is, we can't simply bombard with facts because facts go so far, but they don't necessarily tell the story, which is necessary. But we can't be telling only stories that are not based in connected to the facts and the reality. So finding out that balance is really important and difficult. I think as it relates to science funding, what we're doing is messy, but it's working in a way. We're seeing increases and a kind of steadied continued growth and increases in investments in science coming from this Congress, which is as bitterly partisan as it has been, has seen an issue like science funding be relatively bipartisan and easier to sell than some other issues are. And then even within science, there are there are major winners like biomedical research in the NIH, and then there are places that are having a more difficult time, like EPA and environmental research, you know, gun research, and kind of the softer science research areas. What we're finding is by engaging in all the variety of ways, it's working. We're seeing policymakers be more educated on the issues. I think 10 years ago, every day I talk to scientists, they're concerned about, for instance, basic science and the role that basic research plays and whether a policymaker understands that. And I think today policymakers are far more understanding of the continuum of research, the importance of basic science and the investments there than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So by repeating the message and delivering it over again from the, you know, all of the different scientific societies that are doing it, we're beginning to see some of our messages parroted back to us. We're beginning to hear, you know, the things that we were saying 3 or 4 years ago, people assuming already going into a meeting. So the repetition is working, but there are still challenges, you know, and there are, the priority, how do we get a policymaker to prioritize an issue like science over some of the other issues that are existing and being debated about, right? Science issues don't tend to get the spotlight. There don't tend to be a lot of bills that I can look back to say, well, that was a science bill and that was a science bill. Science tends to be a part of lots of other pieces of legislation. So we're finding that it's working, but again, you know, I find myself really interested in hearing what this research is gonna pan out so that we can better implement the things that we're doing.
Thanks so much, Ben. Great observations. I have a question I'm going to throw out to all three of you now, but first I want to remind everyone on the chat, if you'd like a question to be asked, please just type it into the chat box on the right-hand side, and we'll try to get it in there. So my question for all three of you is, I'd like to hear about your favorite resources to share with this audience of mainly public engagement practitioners, researchers who are studying aspects of science, SciComm and public engagement, and scientists and engineers who are doing public engagement. What are your favorite resources that you can share with the group? I'll start with you this time, Ben.
I'm muted. I like to go to other scientific societies and coalitions that are doing just really good work. You know, I think of the Golden Goose Awards that are done as a really great place to point to. Again, talking about that issue, hey, good plug. You know, that issue of basic science, like helping it's a great source to help the lay public understand that research that maybe we don't understand why we're doing it, the impacts that it has and how beneficial it can be. So that's one place that I really like to look at. The Science Coalition, they had just put out their All-Stars of Science, and I find that to be a really engaging and interesting discussion, helping to shine a spotlight on the policymakers that are bridging the gap, that are getting involved, that are putting skin in the game and really investing. So those are two, and then I'll throw back and let some people throw some others out there.
Great. Karen.
The one book that I've really enjoyed and found useful, and I'm doing another plug for Paul Kearney, but he has a book called The Politics of Evidence-Based Policymaking, which I think does a really nice job of that sort of a not too theoretical and fairly easy read approach.
Fantastic. Liz, how about you?
The National Academy's report that I mentioned earlier called Communicating Science Effectively, a Research Agenda. And then there's also a fairly new Oxford handbook that's come out, the Oxford Handbook of the Science Communication, if people aren't familiar. And, you know, while these both are more on the scholarly end, I think because of the topic, the authors are pretty conscious about bringing in a more applied component, especially the Oxford Handbook of the Science Communication. So,
I also wanted to throw out another a book that I read last summer. I was just looking it up, The David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell, which is not focused on policymaking, but it focused on a variety of people from a variety of areas that were underdogs. And I think science and science advocacy is often an underdog, but learned how to use their weaknesses as strengths and how to change the rules of the game and how to be successful. And so that I think that was a really interesting read and really helped frame my perspective on how to engage.
Excellent suggestions. Thanks, everyone. I'd like to turn now again to Liz and Karen. You've both, as you mentioned, interacted quite a bit with policymakers in your work, and I'd like to hear more about the common threads that have emerged from your interactions with them. Liz, we'll turn to you first.
Research. So I'd add a couple of other things that maybe I was, that were a little bit more surprising to me. So one thing is that there's a debate among folks in this area of research as to the extent to which scientists who are communicating their work should actually weigh in on policy solutions. But I'll say I've so far interviewed over 30 people. That includes about 20 members of Congress. And I have found nobody saying that, these are some double negatives here. So I found no one who says that scientists should not weigh in on policy. Folks are interested in hearing what scientists have to say about not only problems they identify, but solutions to those problems. But of course, they do generally want scientists to be dispassionate as they do weigh in. And the other thing I would say, and I don't mean to end on a negative here, but I remember there was a colloquium in the fall that many of us attended at the National Academies, and Susan Fisk had a presentation where she talked about the fact that there's a stereotype that scientists are cold. Scientists are respected, but they're cold. And you know, I think about that more and more as I've been doing these interviews, because maybe the most frequent criticism I hear is that policymakers, and let me say that the folks I'm interviewing, I've interviewed Democrats and Republicans, and on balance, they're probably more kind of science-oriented than others. I hear a criticism that scientists too often are perceived as talking down to members of Congress or staff, that they can be short, that they can be perceived as ungrateful. Now, this may simply be a culture clash, but in other words, there may be no ill will behind it, but it is something. This is one of these kinds of conclusions that I think will be helpful to applied folks out there.
Great. Karen?
So one of the threads that came up a lot more than I was expecting was about bias. So one of the questions we had was, so we were talking to energy, environment, and science staffers. So people who are the leads, the policy leads on 3 of those committees on the House side and the Senate side. And we were asking them about the information sources they felt they had available to, scientific information sources that were unbiased, politically and ideologically unbiased. And they had a really difficult time in naming sources. So on average, we got about 3. So this is a small sample size, again, to very much take into account. So sample was 16. But on average, we got about 3 sources that they thought were unbiased. And we actually got about a third of the people just told us outright, nobody is unbiased. Everybody has a bias. And so that was one of the things too that we saw continually when we were asking people how they assess credibility. So the 2 points that came up in how they assess sources were, number one, they looked for expertise, which is totally understandable, but they were also looking for bias. And it wasn't necessarily they were looking for a lack of bias. So if bias was against the position of the office, then obviously that was that was an issue. But if the bias was in favor of the issue or towards the similar positions of the office, then that wasn't necessarily an issue. So what they were essentially is trying to understand the motivation of the person who was sitting in front of them. And so I think that's something that, especially in science, we tend to correlate the authority of science with its being unbiased. And I think in this particular context, just because of the nature of how business is done in coalitions in which people all have a common goal, that bias plays a very different role. And I think that's something that we're certainly interested in looking at more.
Excellent, thank you. We have some questions here in the chat, and this next one I'm going to direct to Ben. Is there any work being done to encourage non-scientists to speak to policymakers on science issues?
That's a really great question. And I don't know that I know the answer to it. I think my life is focused on getting scientists to engage. And part of our discussion is often for scientists to bring their their friends. I think the barrier that we're trying to break through is capture that and engage in it. What we found is I'm part of another group, a group called Science Counts, which is focused on engaging the public in supporting science. And some of our polling data that we found is that you can, by targeting a population with information about science, about the benefits of science, it is possible to change their activation level from inactive to involved, or go from involved to highly involved, to a front seat driver of doing it. But we're still in kind of the early stages of reviewing the analysis that we're doing and the research and the projects that we've done and the testing, message testing that we've done in the field. It's a harder nut to crack, right? Because again, for us, it becomes a priority thing. You know, the average citizen maybe isn't engaged in, say, supporting cancer research until there's a member in their family that had cancer, and then suddenly they become more aware and more connected and more engaged with it. And so having to, finding ways to help the public understand how science is affecting them in their daily lives is maybe something that a scientific society is, like mine and others are working to do. And the benefit of that will be getting non-scientists involved in supporting us in advocacy. But I'm not aware of any efforts personally that are getting the non-scientists to the table to support science.
Thanks. This next question I'm going to throw out to any of you who would like to chime in. What are some of the most important messages for STEM researchers to collectively articulate now? And how does that intersect with the need for scientists to provide domain-specific expertise to influence specific policies?
Can you repeat that?
Yes. What are some of the most important messages for STEM researchers to collectively articulate now? Let's start with that one.
So I would say one thing that grows out of some of my conversations with folks on the Hill is that scientists don't do enough to trumpet their successes, past and present and potentially future. And, basically we all need to do a better job being cheerleaders, but not, cheerleaders in an empty way, really pointing to real successes in terms of past advances and lives saved, and policy. People on the Hill always want to hear about jobs generated. And so that seems to be something that ties into this question, that there's a lot of just useful things that comes out of STEM research that is directly beneficial to these communities that members of Congress are serving. And the more they hear about that, the better.
And I think to take that a step further, to be more willing to make the connections between the issues that a constituency might be facing and science. I think there's sometimes a reluctance as scientists to make a broad generalization, maybe your research isn't going to directly have an impact on something, but it may tangentially impact. Talking about being able to go beyond what you exactly know, but where things may go, and being comfortable with doing that, I think, is something that could be very helpful in those discussions, right? Because sometimes the science that's in your lab is very specific and you don't want to draw broad conclusions from it, but policymakers tend to work in this more generalist environment, and helping them to understand that might be helpful.
Excellent. And that is actually the moment where I'm going to turn to Jeff and Emily to talk about the future of this effort. We have 10 more minutes, and that's what we'd like to do with it. So thank you to all of our panelists very much for your wonderful and important insights.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah, so as Jeff said, this is a new effort for us, Jeff at the academies, for us at AAAS, to try to convene folks in this online, more interactive forum. And so we're interested in sort of what are all of you wanting to talk about, and how can we make this forum the best forum to get at the sorts of questions and issues you're facing, and perhaps make some connections between the people that we have been trying to connect on the Trellis platform, that is the scientists who are doing public engagement, the researchers who study science communication and public engagement, and the practitioners who are doing a lot of public engagement and assisting scientists and hopefully making connections between the research and the practice. So I also want to note, and Alana just put this in the comment section, that we can continue to have this discussion on the Trellis group. If you're not a part of the Trellis group, we encourage you to join it. So we'll start the conversation here, and then we can continue it online.
So everyone is now unmuted. If you're not speaking, please mute yourself because there's sometimes background noise, but this is the time to start throwing stuff out. So go ahead. Hopefully we won't get too many people talking over one another. And just before we start, I want to note that our next session, Kishore Hari has volunteered to lead a discussion with some public health researchers about their approach to community engagement that leads to behavioral shift. And they're going to talk about some best practices. And Keish, I don't know if you want to mention anything about that or just go into the discussion.
And in order for the county to accept it, we first have to rebuild the road county.
And if folks are not addressing the group, can you?
They won't take it and then do the improvements.
Right.
All right. Anybody have thoughts on this?
So while folks maybe gather their thoughts, I see there's a question in the discussion about the recording. So yes, this is indeed being recorded. And once the file is all ready, Jeff will post it onto the Trellis group. There's actually a discussion thread already going for this conversation. So if you are not already a part of that Trellis group, Alana will put the link in the chat over here so that folks can join the group.
Any thoughts from anyone?
Jeff, do you want to maybe repeat the question one more time?
Oh yeah, I think what Emily and I were just sort of asking for is sort of, is this the most effective forum to use to have these kinds of discussions? Are there thoughts on other potential forums, potential topics that we could discuss, ways we could engage, really any way? I mean, I think the idea here is to sort of build up the community so that we're talking to one another more often. So just ways to do that.
And I think just to add on to that, it also the topics that we discuss. So we've gathered a number of suggestions already via Twitter and via the discussion on Trellis. But if there are particular topics that you're just like really interested in talking about, let us know, because, and especially if you would like to be one of the speakers on that or help us organize a session related to that topic.
Hey, this is Kishore. Can I offer a couple things that I'd love to see this group do?
Go for it.
So one thing is that public engagement, while relatively new in the US as sort of like a field, I feel like we have a lot to learn from our international friends on this topic. So I'd love to see an internationally focused discussion. Two, I always love hearing from people that have been doing public engagement in other fields as a way of bringing in their knowledge base into the world of science, especially when it's from, you know, fields that we wouldn't even think of initially considering. And lastly, even though like a lot of us know each other here, we don't know always know what's going on day to day with our projects and programs. So I'd love some space to learn about what each of us are doing. Maybe there's a way we can have a few people share every month what a little bit about their program.
Yep, that sounds great.
Lisa Eibach at Michigan. I would also be really interested in thinking through with this community what mechanisms of institutional change would look like, and what successful examples have that can be brought to bear into thinking about institutionally changing our support structures, the way that we encourage more people to do engagement work, that kind of thing.
Thanks, Elise.
Yeah, that's a great point, Elise, and I think that's something that we've been really thinking about at AAAS with things like the Leshner Leadership Institute, but there are so many different models for how to build capacity for public engagement at academic institutions and in other institutions. Thinking about how to develop those partnerships more fully is something that would be a great topic for a future discussion here.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Comments about the format and structure of how this ran? Timing? Anything?
Can I throw out a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I would simply like to know if anybody is aware of the research that's been going on in science communication with the public, and what aspects of what's been learned about that aspects of science communication could be brought over to apply to communication with policymakers as well. Is there a body of research on that, on integrating the two forms of knowledge?
So just so I would quickly note that this is something that we are doing a little bit with our project. We certainly are taking some of the findings from engaging with the public and bringing it over. You know, I do want to make one, maybe this is too esoteric of a point, but some people would argue that when you talk about engaging with the public, actually policymakers would be considered part of the public because they're not scientists. Maybe there's some debate about that. But my view is that much of what has been learned about communicating with the public is going to be relevant to communicating with policymakers, because they are basically lay people when it comes to science, and then there's just going to be more to layer on top of that and to you know, tweak a bit. But I think a lot of what's been found is relevant, and one of the examples I gave earlier was, you know, the communication with the public literature emphasizes the importance of storytelling and narrative, and that was spontaneously raised by so many of my interview subjects.
That's interesting that you mention it, because there is a good deal of theoretical literature about the role of storytelling and narrative in mass communication and in science communication. Certainly some of that could be brought in to communication with policymakers as well.
It's a good
Yeah,
point.
I think that already there's a huge policy narrative literature, and that certainly connects quite well with understand. So in fact, literally a lot of the people who are doing that work are using some of the same frameworks, like the advocacy coalition framework, to thinking about how coalitions essentially manufacture narratives and then use those. So I think, and the advocacy coalition framework is actually integrates scientific information and beliefs. So I do think you are seeing cross-pollination across the, and as I mentioned, both the, so the communication literature is largely built on a lot of psychology-based as well as its own literature. And I think you certainly are seeing those being pulled in, as I mentioned. A lot of the work where I think the synergies that are really fascinating are between those fields.
All right, great. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so we're ending right on the button. So thank you everybody for joining us. We have been recording this, so as Emily said, it'll be posted and shared, and we are going to look to do this again next month, August 17th. So mark your calendars, and we'll spread out announcements about that. Yes, and we'll go with the logistics and improve on those as well. Hopefully everybody had an easy enough time getting online and participating in the conversation. So again, thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to Erin for moderating. And thanks to Emily and Alana for all their help with this. And thanks to all of you. And we will continue the discussion.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.